Welcome to alumni, welcome to instructors, welcome to students, welcome to friends of the faculty. It's great to have you all here. My name is Professor Greg Evans. I have the privilege of serving as the director of ISTEP, or the Institute for Studies in Transdisciplinary Engineering Education and Practice. I challenge any of you to say that quickly. So, it's my pleasure to welcome you here, which I've done several times now, and before we get started, I do want to acknowledge that the land upon which the University of Toronto is on for thousands of years was the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, who unfortunately got run off the land, the Senecas, and more recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit. This is still the meeting place and the home of many Indigenous people, and we are happy to be able to meet ourselves and serve on this land as well. A part of acting ethically, which is the topic of today's seminar, is taking responsibility, and so I'd encourage you to engage in reflection and discussion tonight, and remember that acting ethically also involves our responsibility to the land and our responsibility to our Indigenous people, something that I am reminded of every day by my wife. So, ISTEP has had the privilege of hosting the Fred Kahn Lecture since its inception, 2019. You may have noticed on the posters we did miss a year during the COVID, so this is our fifth year. And it's been a real honor. And it's been an honor to have so many experts come in, huge variety of engineering backgrounds, and they've lent us their knowledge and their experience over the years. The conversations and insights have been great. One of the things I personally have found incredible value to is the opportunity to learn, to reflect, think about new ways of thinking, and these have also served as a catalyst for future collaboration. So really the series has been a wonderful success. The series invites people to think, to share insights, to challenge us to think differently about things, something that is central to ISTEP's mission. And the series has been made possible from a generous donation by Mr. Fred Kahn. So we're very grateful to Mr. Fred Kahn for supporting this important initiative. And I'm going to ask you to join me in a round of applause for Mr. Fred Kahn. That's it for me, but I do have one last task. It's my pleasure to introduce my colleague, my friend, the Dean of Engineering. I'm not your friend? I was really worried by that look. I was going, whoa. Professor and Dean Yip has been the faculty dean since 2009. You gotta wait. Since 2009, and he's a fellow professor in the Department of Chemical Engineering, which is my home department. Under his leadership and direction, the faculty continues to focus on the impact of engineering solutions in building equitable and sustainable communities. So now I'd like you to welcome Professor Dean Yip.
Great, thanks, Greg. Really fantastic to see everyone here tonight demonstrating your commitment to engineering ethics. I'd like to start this a little bit of a story. Earlier this year, I was in Hong Kong for the Canadian Engineering Asia Pacific Conference, and this was a really cool conference. Alumni from 17 different Canadian schools were there, 6 different provinces represented. 8 engineering deans went over for this event. Over 300 alum were present at this event. Terrific opportunity to connect with friends and alumni. And this was an event to really reflect about the impact of Canadian engineering in the region. This was tied a little bit, as many of students know, in particular, many of you will know, there may not be anyone here who got their ring 100 years ago, but there was a centenary of the Iron Ring last year, in 2025. And there was the thought that we should do this in the Asia-Pacific region because there are so many alums in the Asia-Pacific region. And this was the brainchild of a certain individual who shall remain nameless, Fred Kahn, who for years had said, I would love to do an Iron Ring ceremony in Hong Kong and Asia Pacific, even was preceding this, because he saw the value and the impact of the obligation in engineering ethics and the Canadian perspective on this. And so he pushed and pushed, and so we held this event. And what was amazing was the timing. This was 3 days after Prime Minister Carney did his speech in Davos. This was just after he had talked about new partnerships in China. And the whole conference was all about Canada as a trusted source, a trusted country, and it so resonated with the context of the ring and the obligation. And so we did it as a reflection of 100 years of the ring, because that was kind of a milestone, but it was more about the 125 years of Canadian engineering and impact in the region. And so this really reflects sort of this whole context now about engineering ethics, how engineers excel at solving problems, tough problems, but in the global context and with a very holistic perspective. And how engineering, it's not just about your undergraduate degree. Yes, Chem-Eng is the best engineering. You're supposed to, yes, yeah, there we go. I had to say that. Here's a few claps. Or it could be Mech, because Chem and Mech are basically the same letters, just mixed up. But it's about the foundational things we do in engineering, but the careers we take out of it, right? We go to different areas. You can look around the room. Not everybody is practicing engineering. They're in different fields, whether it's law, medicine, business, and others. And it's really about this tradition. And I want to give a bit of a shout out to a certain individual, a number of individuals in this room, who this year launched the Iron Pin ceremony. Jen, you want to stand up? Because you're a major architect for this. Give Jen a clap. So for those who don't know, the Iron Pin is kind of a way, so we get the iron ring to bookend the end of our undergraduate path. The Iron Pin is something to symbolize the beginning of that path, and a recognition of where you're headed towards a profession and your commitment towards ethical behavior and the public good and public trust. And this is something that the students themselves create. It's unique to each individual institution that has done it. I think we're the 8th, 10th? Yeah, somewhere in there. 10, we're sub 10, sub double digits. Yeah, so among the first, put it that way, in Canada to help create this. And I'm going to give a huge shout out to Jen for doing this. Taking the initiative. This is something that's been percolating for a number of years within NSOC. Major props to Inho and to Ken for driving from the NSOC side and for Jen to build this up. And it's an amazing symbol, and I want to congratulate them for building that symbolism for our students as they come in first year and as they move towards getting their iron ring. So again, as Greg was saying, this is ISTEP houses the Fred Kahn lecture. And it's really about the engineering education and the ethical and the leadership aspects of engineering and how we continue to pursue those and drive those forward. Fred is a great example of someone who took his engineering training in a completely different direction. He went from engineering in the 60s, enrolled in law school at U of T, became one of the first Chinese lawyers in Ontario, and has continued to remain an active member of the community. Director and honorary legal advisor of the UT Hong Kong Foundation, former president of UT Alumni Association Hong Kong, still a proud wearer of his iron ring. It still fits. I'll put that out. One of the things I had to do when I went back to Hong Kong is I actually got a number of rings, and I went and I didn't re-ring them per se because I didn't want to get in trouble with the wardens, but I presented the rings to other, and that was the deep symbolism in that room at that time when we were doing that. In 1992, Fred was honored with an Arbor Award for his volunteer work with U of T. And again, as Greg mentioned, he created this lecture series in 2019 as a forum for us to learn, debate, and discover more about the intersection of ethics and engineering. This is the conclusion of his series, and I think we're looking forward to tonight's lecture. We know that these lectures are going to reverberate well beyond this and can continue. The connections here will be catalysts for future collaborations. And I'm really, again, on behalf of the faculty, I want to thank Fred for his vision and dedication to creating this lecture series. Over the past 5 years, the lecture series really explored a breadth of ethics topics, ethical frameworks tied to engineers' professional practice, implications with automated vehicles, AI, particularly now, and what's happening with AI, municipal infrastructure. These are huge challenges that I think our students are all recognizing and are going to be part of the solution as we go forward. Tonight's concluding lecture, we focus on the ethical lessons grounded in biomedical engineering. That's my other home. Greg, you didn't say that. That's the other half of me, is in biomedical engineering. Our distinguished speaker tonight is Professor Justin Hess. Justin, Professor Hess, is the Associate Professor of Engineering Education and Co-Director of the Multidisciplinary Engineering and Interdisciplinary Engineering Studies programs in the School of Engineering Education at Purdue University. A little bit of a joke, one of my best friends from grad school, Dave Barr, is currently the Senior Associate Dean at Purdue, former head of material science. So I sent Dave a note saying that Justin was up here, and he said, "Don't steal Justin." I said, "I will not steal Justin, but I will pretend I'm stealing him so that you can give him a retention offer to keep him at Purdue." So previously, Justin served as the Assistant Director of the STEM Education Innovation and Research Institute at Indiana University, Purdue University in Indianapolis, or ooey pooey is apparently the other way you say that. Professor Hess is a triple graduate at Purdue, receiving his PhD from Purdue University School of Engineering Education, along with a Master's of Science and Bachelor of Science in Civil Engineering. His research focuses on empathy's functional role within engineering and educational transformation engineering, addressing students' socio-technical learning and design ethics, sustainability, and innovation. Most recently, he's been exploring what motivates engineers to think and act ethically, particularly in the domain of biomedical engineering. And I look forward to tonight, as he illustrates one line of analysis by sharing a number of critical incidents experienced by engineering faculty who conduct this research. Looking forward to what I'm sure is going to be an illuminating talk. Again, thank you everyone for attending tonight. Special thanks to Fred Kahn, and please join me in welcoming Justin to U of T.
Thank you all for coming, and thank you for the very warm reception. It's been an insightful day already, and night last night. We went to Piano for the foodies in the crowd. I'm honored to be here, and thank you to Fred Kahn. I know this is the 5th lecture. I hope it's not the last. I hope this leads into what more insightful events in community development. My background's in civil engineering, as Dean Yip shared. I've been working with biomedical engineers for more than a decade now. For some reason, I guess I'm drawn to the biomedical engineers. I even did a mini postdoc. So this project is situated around biomedical engineers, but I don't think it's limited, right? I'm not gonna get into any technical biomedical engineering details in this talk. I think all of the lessons I'll share today are transferable to anyone who does research, not just engineering research. Let me fast forward a few slides. Great. So the title of the talk today is What Inspires Ethical Research? And these are lessons drawn from biomedical engineering faculty. Cindy used the word facilitator. When I teach, I like to facilitate. I like to listen and respond. And so we're gonna dive into that at least a little bit here at the start, and maybe at least once more later in the talk. So for this warm-up questions, you have some options for those who have conducted research. What has inspired you, right? What has inspired you to pursue ethical research? What has gotten in the way? What has been challenging, or what challenges have you encountered? If you haven't conducted research before, and I encourage you to think creatively about what counts as research as you answer these questions. But if you feel like you have not conducted research, what do you think supports the pursuit of ethical research? And what ethical challenges do you think researchers encounter? So turn to a neighbor or two, and then I'll invite some folks to share in a few minutes. What inspires? Emily, yeah. Unintended consequences. Oh, blind spots. Are those the same thing or different things?
Slightly different.
Yeah. What unintended consequences do you think of?
I usually think about
Environmental.
Not thinking about it, mining and not thinking about the water stream.
Yeah.
And sort of
Yeah.
legacy impacts.
Yeah, that's great. The harms and the everlasting harms, perhaps. That's great. Others? We all think about harms. Yeah.
We come from very different disciplines to engineering, but one of the things we have is ethical funding.
Funding. What? Oh, okay. Uh-huh. Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So I'll try to repeat, right? The question about the funding, where it comes from and what strings are attached to it, and what maybe actions are expected, and maybe you disagree with yeah, and the results, yeah. That's great. Maybe one more? Yeah. Animal studies, that's really pertinent to the biomedical engineers. I'm not bringing in an animal study today, but lots of stories. We're gonna talk about norms, and IACUC being one of the key organizations for BME, that'll come into the talk a little bit. Anybody else? I saw another hand up. We can do one more, yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So dealing with macroethics, these bigger societal issues, and individuals feeling comfortable, confident, handling those. This is all great. You're going to see some results today, and I would be interested in seeing if what you've shared, what you've discussed, aligns with the results. You know, as a scientist or a researcher, I'm always trying to improve my work, which is also a feature of the talk. There's 4 takeaways that I hope you'll bring from this, and in some ways, these seem a little simple, but I think they're important for us to keep in mind. There's a lot of factors. There's a lot of things that inspire ethical engineering research. And it might vary. And for you as a person, you probably have many things that you thought of and discussed already, right? Cultural and professional norms are off-cited factors, things we often see referenced in the interview data we'll share. These things seem to provide a foundation in the context of biomedical engineering here about what is right, what is ethical, what we should do. Time, right? I don't know if anybody has heard of Mary Gentili. She's in business. She offers this curriculum about giving voice to values. And one of the techniques is expanding time. And so I'm borrowing on this a little bit. Time itself, devoting time to ethics, to community, to conversations, to lectures like this, I think is really critical. And often we don't devote the time that I think ethics needs in our institutions. And finally, engineering education research is invaluable, I think, for providing ethics education, particularly those that are aligned with students' future careers, right? So I might use the phrase translating research to practice. I see that as a guide for a lot of my work. I love talking with engineers, researchers, but the end goal for me often is having an impact on the students in our courses, in our labs. So this project, the talk today, is informed by a research study, and I have an awesome team who's here with me, both in terms of feedback and the slides and much of the work that I'll be presenting. Andrew Brightman, who is one of the founders of reflexive principlism. I hear that's pretty popular in some classes here. Nicholas Fila, Ali Kerr, Tyler Ramsey, and Soumya Panuganti. So this award is funded through the National Science Foundation, and as you may know with NSF, it's important to emphasize that this is based on my views. These views do not represent the National Science Foundation, nor Purdue University or Iowa State University. So in this project, the NSF ER2, and I think I skipped over this, ER2 stands for Ethical and Responsible Research. That's the program and NSF that funded this project. We bring 3 research questions. The first is, what are the qualitatively different ways of experiencing and understanding ethical engineering research by faculty members in biomedical engineering? So this question is, we're using this methodology called phenomenography, which brings the theory that people experience ethics differently. And I think that's sometimes what makes ethics hard, is we're all starting from different points. But per that theory, there's structural relationships between the ways of experiencing. I'm not talking about that research question today, but I'm happy to, if there's questions, share some of the findings around this research question. RQ2, which is the focus of today's talk, asks what critical factors influence ways of experiencing and understanding ethical engineering research by faculty members in biomedical engineering. And the third question, which is in some ways, building on this ultimate goal, is translating research to practice, asks, how can faculty members' experiences with ethical engineering research inform more effective educational heuristics for preparing ethical engineering researchers. So as I mentioned, the focus in this talk is on the second research question. And just to make it really clear, I'm not here arguing what ethics is today, right? That's not the focus. The focus is what inspires, what promotes ethics, or maybe makes it challenging for researchers. So to address this research question, we use this methodology called critical incident technique, or CIT for short. So this methodology has been around for several decades. It has its origins in psychology. It's also been used to study ethics, including in a bunch of different domains and disciplines, and to different ends, to identify the challenges that managers experience, or to think about the climate of nursing practice. It's also been used in engineering. Me, Nick Fila, and Dayoung Kim actually use this to study how practitioners in the health products industry come to experience ethics in their practice. And also Laszlo Stepback and team have looked at the experiences of early career engineers, right? What are the critical experiences folks encounter right out of the gate as they enter the workforce? Our data set for this study is phenomenographic interviews. And so these are interviews where there's 4 sections, and the main one is really the second, right? The goal is to thoroughly explore 1 to 3 experiences with ethical engineering research. Who was involved? What was the challenge? What did you do? Why did you do it, right? Until we understand the experience as thoroughly as we can. Most interviews cover 1 or 2, but every once in a while we'll get to the 3rd. One thing I'll note is that these are not critical incident interviews, which means that we're not necessarily asking questions around criticality. And I'll talk more about that here in a bit. Our participants had varying ranks or tenure statuses, as you can see here. So diverse in terms of their tenure rank and whether or not they're even on tenure track. With most already received tenure. We had a predominantly male sample. We had 25 interviews total that we conducted, and also a predominantly white sample. One thing I'll note is that recruitment on this was surprisingly difficult. And so maybe it's a bias in our data set, but most of the folks we think value ethics, and that's probably not surprising, right? But I think that's important to note as a potential limitation, as well as these demographics. Critical incident technique, right, requires identifying critical incidents. So from these really deep phenomenographic or in-depth phenomenographic interviews, we tried to put bounds around these things called critical incidents, which are kind of like key events, key stories, right, that have 3 elements. Something happened, something influenced how they think about, practice, or understand ethics. An outcome, they learned something, now they do something differently in their labs or when they approach research. And then sufficient antecedent information, sufficient context to really feel like we understand what's going on, the who, what, when, where, why. And thank you, Julietta, for scattering results. What you have as a handout that I was not sure whether or not to submit, but you know what? We got a lot of results, and I thought it would be helpful to share this with you before we get into some of the results, because I'm not going to be able to share all of the stories in the 40 minutes we have. In this study, we identified 145 critical incidents from the 25 interviews, and what we did is we sorted them into what we call incident types. So types of critical experiences. From these incident types, we engaged in second order coding where we grouped them into 5 categories. First being cultural immersions, so being within a culture and practicing, right? Practicing according to the norms, rules, spoken or unspoken. The second being ethical actions. These include actions that you do, so imagine you've acted ethically, maybe in certain ways, maybe in really difficult situations, or perhaps observing others who have acted ethically, or even the converse. Maybe you've engaged in a questionable activity in your life, maybe as a grad student, wherever it might be, or others, right? Maybe you've observed others do something that you felt was questionable. The third is novel perspectives. So coming to see and take serious new perspectives on thinking about ethics, and usually this involves some communication event. The fourth is the training events, so teaching or training. That can be the recipient of teaching or training, or perhaps even providing it, right? And I think one of our most common incident types, I don't have numbers here, but a lot of folks were teachers, right? And they would teach ethics, and through teaching, they would learn more about what they think about this thing called ethical engineering research. And then finally, this idea of reflection associations is making new associations through critical reflections on one or perhaps more, multiple, or a career of ethical engineering research events. So take a minute. Do I dare to break? This is the question. Or do I put you back in groups? 2 minutes, 3 minutes maybe. Get in your groups really quickly, and I'll invite some people to report back. Which of these categories do you think are essential, right? Must-haves for inspiring ethical engineering research in your labs, if you have labs, or if you're in labs, your programs, your discipline, and/or your institution? You can pick the scale. You don't have to cover all 4 in 2 to 3 minutes. What do you think? Yeah, I love this. You're answering the question, who's responsible for the training? Are you partially answering that? Yeah. Yeah. The institution, and that's usually the case. Institutions are responsible. But you think an institution can mandate the contextual, but you're talking a lot about context, right? I think, so most agencies, NIH and NSF are two of the big ones for biomedical engineers, especially NIH. To an extent, right, the institution has a responsibility per NIH mandates to make sure there's discipline-specific training, right? And they provide guidance, and has everyone taken city training? City, is that not a thing in Canada? That's CITI? And we have cities? Okay, well, in the US, it's kind of the baseline, right, for training. I think providing these experiences that we agree all are important can't just be up to the institution, though. I think it's up to everyone within the institution. This connects back to the idea of devoting time, right? It was a trick question in part, but in getting to the point where I think they are all important, but do we spend as much time on all of them as maybe we need to? I'm not sure, and even among our, yeah, jump in. Mm-hmm. Yeah. 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 Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. We give examples, and so the concern was there's blind spots when we use this word culture. Mm-hmm. 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 Yeah. I think that's great. I think, so you have a handout. Maybe I'll transition to this really poor slide and hence the handout. So we have the 5 categories, and I've mentioned the 14 incident types, right? And so as you look at those incident types, you see, more specifics about what we mean by these categories. And I'm glad you picked on the word culture, because I have a slide later where, here when we're using the word culture, we're really talking about discipline-specific norms or institutional norms, right? Those are the cultures we're talking about. Later in the talk, right, we did follow-up interviews with folks, and they didn't like that we weren't talking about international culture, like global experiences. I'm not going to go into all of these 14 incident types. It's the reason I gave the handout, so you can take it with you. And if you're interested, please check out the paper. What I am going to do is go into 3 of these with example incidents, right? So you'll hear a couple stories from some of our participants in the study, which will give you kind of a flavor, or, better understanding, I hope, of some of these incidents, and also I think the power of this methodology. So our first incident type on that list is common practices and norms, right, folded within the cultural immersions category. And this involves discovering or abiding by common practices or norms within an organization or discipline, right? So there's an action aspect to this, right? You're acting according to those norms. So this first example comes, this one example of this incident type comes from Sai, who's a female full professor. Her research focuses on polymers. In this incident, she described her institution's response to a removal from a nationally funded project where she served as senior personnel. Because they were a senior personnel rather than a co-investigator, so if you're on a grant, usually there's a principal investigator, co-investigator, senior personnel. She didn't have a tangible way to do anything about this, right? The PI and ostensibly co-investigators have that power. They tried to work with the institution, and they look at the bright side, I think, of this experience, describing both positive and negative aspects of their institution's response, including how the norms of the institution, coupled with the funding agency's requirements, led, right, to eventually her being off the grant at the PI's discretion. So the incident begins with Sai's depiction of the organizational practices and how those were informed by sponsor requirements. So we're talking about 2 institutions here, right? The institution of higher education and the funding body. So Sai shares, internally I was advised by people within the university what my courses I had, even if the sponsor didn't require notification of being removed, right? There was enough documentation that kind of showed that this was an arbitrary decision by the PI and that I would still receive the agreed upon summer compensation and then thereafter would no longer be on the project, but I had to personally, through internal channels, try to resolve the situation so that I could at least get the compensation for the work that had already been done. Sai goes on to describe both pros and cons, right, of this institutional response, including the norms that they felt needed improvement. And I think that's one thing to know about the norms category, right? A lot of folks talk about improving the norms themselves. So Sai shares, I felt it was taken seriously, and it was. Tangible repercussions were applied to the PI on the grant because of how things were managed and things that were done and said about me by this person that were not okay. It does seem like there's a tolerance for that, and repeat offenses are tolerated. And so maybe this system where if there's constantly where there's smoke, there's fire, so that these people can be managed in a way that they don't professionally harm people that they work with. I don't know about ultimately was anything adopted out of that, but I think when situations get elevated and it's not just, well, we'll talk to so-and-so and whatever, things get elevated. I feel like that has to kind of leave a mark on the mindsets of administrators that we have to take these kind of issues really seriously. Did a formal policy come out of this though? No, right? So this is the last slide with Sai. So she left the incident with a new perspective regarding what constitutes an ethical individual and what institutions should do in events like this. Their response was very methodical. Many people were involved with resolving the situation and assuring people that it wouldn't happen again. And I think that's what I conveyed to one administrator. Had I known everything about this person beforehand, I might not have worked with them, but the fact that this person they seem to have no problem mistreating colleagues, I think it's something that you all were aware of, and there was enough pushback against them prior to each of these situations. Maybe it's an unethical thing when you don't truly deal with bad players or people who have habitual issues with certain things. I'm not sure if when we talk about ethical funding, this is what we were talking about, but I do think there's some perhaps improvements to the funding landscape itself. I think Sai is requesting or looking for here. The second incident type we call ethical tensions. So these are when there's maybe tensions between values or conflicting perspectives on how to move forward in a case. And usually our participants weren't necessarily saying there's a right answer, right, a right way forward. So this example comes from Zai, who is a male full professor whose research focuses on diagnostics and instrumentation. Zai describes his observations regarding the creation and solicitation of AI tools and student uses in courses and research, something that I expect many of us are dealing with. Because they were senior personnel, gosh, I didn't update this part. Okay, we can move on, ignore that. That was Sai coming in, or Sai coming into Zai's. This is the problem with Greek letters. Sometimes you regret decisions, and we're committed at this point, we have publications, but so Zai was approached by a solicitor, a company who was encouraging them to use generative AI to help with the review of research. There's a lot of tools out there now, and these interviews were about 2 years ago, right? So still on the up and up. So as I shared, I got a solicitor talking about, we have this new tool to help you review your research articles and synthesize information based on the review articles you submit to the database or the machine, and then they can extract data. I say, well, this is great, but at the same time, it opens the possibility people could steal data from other publications and synthesize a new set of data and then publish the work, which the person didn't do. I think there's a lot wrapped in here, right? Intellectual property concerns are maybe front and center, but several others. Nonetheless, I recognize, right, there's some potential affordances of generative AI in research, but he had outstanding concerns in trust, right? Trust in research, including in his lab or in the research enterprise, was kind of key. So as I shared, I'm worried about the future of research. Can we avoid false information, false data, or false results? In the future, it's going to be harder and harder to safeguard the accuracy of scientific research in this age of AI. So as researchers, right, we constantly look for ways to speed up our research. We automate the data acquisition process, and we use this computer software or script to analyze data, but it's very easy to make mistakes, i.e. the more we rely on technology, right? If you detect the mistake, do you go back to redo everything, or do you just choose to overlook the mistakes, say the results look good, so let's move forward with publication, or other things anyways? And I think as you can read the language, right, kind of thinking through the response. I guess the engineers or researchers need to verify how they use these modern tools more carefully so they can trust their own data. So this final example I will share today comes from Alpha. I'm a male assistant professor with a teaching focus. And so Alpha describes, and this is in the critical reflection category, describes how the interview itself gave them time and opportunity to critically reflect on their own understanding of this thing called ethical engineering research. Through the interview itself, they generated new and actionable considerations for promoting data safety and ensuring appropriate lab access. So they also left with new pedagogical considerations for presenting ethics to engineering students. So they describe novel associations, as I shared, and as Alpha states, I reflected a lot better in the past 2 hours than I really ever have. I mean, even when I was creating the lecture about the yeast work and ethical experience, Alpha described it thoroughly at length in the interview. I was so focused on some of the technology parts and kind of was going to ad-lib a lot of the ethical conversation in their class. But this gave me a lot of perspective, again, how to frame it in a way that students can better absorb the material. Really meet different learning objectives in terms of how they interface with ethical decision-making. But they also are developing novel concerns, right, through this reflection. I've got an interesting thought that I never really thought about until just now. Do we need to do any sort of background check on people that are coming into the lab and that are working with this? Do we need to be concerned about somebody coming in here that's to steal this strain, right? They were concerned about this strain in illicit drug development amidst a crisis. So I'm trying to get students to ask those questions now before they start projects, because I think that's something that you might not be able to get an answer for, but the fact that you're having the question means that when you go off to be a professional engineer, hopefully this will happen. So this is, I've mentioned, right, I'm gonna share a little bit more results, not too much, but I think there's an ethics reflection question here too. I don't know if anyone wants to share their thoughts, but when is research done? Or alternatively, when it is time to publish, right, what we found? You probably know, right, we submitted a conference paper on these findings, but I mentioned at the start, these were phenomenography interviews. They were not critical incident interviews. So we did follow-up interviews. We invited everyone to participate in a second interview where we were focused on critical incidents, and we also shared the results with them to see if there's missing categories or incident types in this data. So I'll show you on the next slide just an example of this portion of the interview, the review, where we would have them actually reflect on and then critique the data that we had. So we would give them the results, and then we would say, can you think of an experience you had that represents one or more of these incident types? Right? So not out of the gate saying, will you critique these, but like, tell us about an experience aligned with these. And some people talked about the same experiences from the first interview. As you can imagine, they're talking about really powerful experiences. They're revisiting them with us again. But also, are there other critical experiences that you've encountered that aren't represented here? Right, so through that process, we did identify 10 more incident types, and we refined the categories. And so I mentioned earlier the word culture, right? One thing participants were really disliked was this feeling that like engaging with cultures, right, other than your own, thinking from the US, right, maybe going to a non-US culture was missing. As I mentioned earlier, that first category was really about professional immersions though, you know, in your discipline, BME, or at your institutions. So that slightly changed. We also added a new category called ethical challenges. And this borrowed from the ethical tensions from another category. We also added an incident type called ethical conflict, right? There's sometimes, I mentioned the tensions is sometimes there's a give and take, there's not a right way forward. But I think sometimes, like, you know the right answer and somebody else disagrees, right? And so there are situations, you know, that we sorted into this new category called ethical conflict. The next is perspective considerations, which was a spin on the novel perspectives category. So that in a way is there, but slightly reframed. Critical reflections, right? We added this word critical, right? There's something, you know, it's not just reflection, it's critical reflection. I'm happy to elaborate on that if you want. And then finally, a new category with new incident types we called self-influences. So think about your own personal values, right, informing your practice. Maybe your upbringing and how that comes into your work. So I mentioned at the start, 4 takeaways. I'm gonna revisit each of these here in turn. Lots of factors, right, inspire ethical engineering research. It's really hard to kind of whittle it down. And for many people, it's multiple, right? Many things have probably inspired each of you. I know that's the case for me. With that said, cultural and professional norms are off-sided factors, right? I think we need to devote time, and I think engineering education research provides one way to help us think about how to do this well, recognizing the time constraints of academia. So I didn't give you this slide. I wouldn't call it quite final, right? Our emergent, our 10 additional incident types. One thing I do want to note, though, is that the majority of these incident types are incidental. A lot of them are not purposeful ethics training, right? Our institutions didn't plan for many of these. Maybe it's a good actor, like an awesome PI, mentoring someone, right? So there's a lot of variation in the ethics training our students get. With that said, cultural and professional norms, they're often cited, right? Even in the other incident types, we see these kind of manifesting. And so I think of them as kind of a foundation, right? Especially for biomedical engineers. Things like your institutional review board, in the case of biomedical engineering, IACUC, the discipline norms, right? What it means to be a good biomedical engineer, or maybe other institutions like our funding agencies. Devoting time, I think, is necessary. And again, I know we have a constrained academic environment where time's a luxury sometimes. I think we see that among our participants too. I mentioned these are folks who really care about ethics. They have a lot of ideas and a lot of time, maybe a bit of regret that they couldn't do more. So I gave the incident type where just guiding folks through a reflection could be a critical incident, right? Making new connections. One example from one of our participants is think about their lab Bible, right? Developing their own lab norms, and within that, time, right? Time devoted to ethics discussions every month or more often is something that they wish they would do. They noted they do it about every year. They want to do it more often, right? And finally, this idea of engineering education research, right? And this project itself, this is maybe a too complicated graphic, but one of the things we're doing in this project is engaging biomedical engineers through consultants on the grant as one community of practice and the online ethics center community of practice the Online Ethics Center should live on past the grant, right? So that's per sustainability. But the goal of this community is to reflect on the findings, identify how they can inform practices, and then translating, right, those into their own curriculums, their courses, their labs. So if you go to ASE, please join us. Andrew Brightman and Ali Kerr have led this component of the grant. We'll be presenting, I think, all of us in 2026. Okay, so thank you for listening. And are there any questions? Yeah. Did I go over time?
So we'll do a little bit of synthesis afterwards, but it's really interesting to me to hear about people who study ethics as a topic, like what is this thing about ethics, and who study engineering ethically. And I think often when we talk about ethics, we talk about what is ethics, what are some philosophical, is this even on? Probably not. Ethical questions, and what you did is more universal. That all of us do a thing, and it's up to us to do that thing ethically. So I really appreciate what you just did. Do folks have questions? You seem to know half the audience already, so you can do your own Q&A if you want. I'll just stand here.
No, I want to hear your statistics.
That was it.
So I'm wondering, you emphasized a couple times that culture really was, you're talking about culture of organization, culture of different engineering disciplines. So how different do you think your findings would be if you'd done it in one of the superior programs like chemical engineering? Sorry, didn't mean to, I always joke, it's bad form. But
Do our biomedical engineers agree? Chemical?
Yeah, what do you think? Do you think the findings would have been any different?
I'm not sure, right? One of our critiques when we did the round 2 interviews were like, these could be applicable to anyone, right? One of the suggestions we haven't gotten to yet, but contextualize this with the types of questions that biomedical engineering researchers would ask that would be different from others. I think biomedical engineering has this like people-centered orientation, and of course animals come into serious consideration in biomedical engineering. And so animals are present in the data, right? They're present in these findings. We didn't have an animal-centric category. My background's in civil engineering. I might imagine we might see some more environmental considerations than we saw among these participants. That's not to say that they're missing, right? I don't know, what do you think? Chemical engineering, would it be, are they transferable?
I would say yes, you touched upon one consideration, so biomedical tends to be closer to relational, where something like chemical considerations often would be a process of what escapes the less than perfect process, whereas civil would be implications on the surrounding community, society, mechanical would be implications from safety of cars or transportation. So, but it might come down to some of the same themes.
Yeah. And I didn't engage in the incidents in the novel perspectives category, but within some of those incidents, think of PETA, think of your animal rights advocacy groups. Some of our participants had to deal, right, with very anti, work depending on the research. I'm not sure if you'll see as much of that in other disciplines of engineering, but I do think this broader idea of thinking about what the public wants is very transferable to civil engineering, right? And it's a key goal, I think, especially as we're dealing with macro level infrastructure, right? Yeah.
Just on that, I was raised in mechatronics engineering, and so I really wonder how this conversation would differ in that discipline, because it is so disconnected from humans often. But my question, so we talked briefly about how the onus of teaching how to do ethical research is perhaps on the institution, but as you mentioned, a lot of these critical incidences don't happen in like rigid settings, and they come from more emergent incidents. And you also mentioned with your community of practice that one of the things that you're talking about is figuring out how to integrate this into teaching. And so how do you suggest that we take these more emergent practices but then implement them in a structured way in the classroom?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of power in stories, right? And so that's a question we actually keep asking ourselves. How do we get these stories where they need to go? A lot of our participants would talk about sharing their own stories, right? And I think that's always applicable. I think conversation is really critical to see new perspectives as you look at that category. How you guide that conversation can vary. I mean, I'm offering kind of like the interview protocol we had as a way to engage students in these conversations. We had some conversations around safe spaces earlier. I mean, I think that's really important if you're going to have candid and critical conversations. You know, one of the heuristics we're developing a whole bunch of heuristics, and if you're not familiar with the term, they're kind of like rules, right? Kind of like rules of thumb or suggestions to spark a creative idea, such as, you know, how to teach ethics differently. So in part, kind of is expired by, you know, some of the regret maybe some participants have. Like we have a participant who, you know, was questioning the research they did as a grad student, right? So one of the heuristics that, you know, one of our co-PIs is you know, unsure of, and we've had good conversations, is this idea of failure. Right, so acting ethically and experiencing failure, right, can be a learning opportunity. Do we really want our students to fail? I think there could be micro failures. I don't know, you can take that type of thinking, I think, to any of these incidents and say, how can this inform something that we can bring into our class, but in a safe way, right? Does that answer your question? Yeah, okay, great, thank you.
Hi, good night. I love the speech. Thank you. So I think there's a lot of intersecting complexities when we speak about ethics, and it can be related across multiple fields. But I'm thinking, and correct me if I'm wrong, adaptability is very important when it comes to ethics because there are changing perspectives. What we thought of 10 years ago, it's different now. We're constantly evolving our needs as a society and the environment at large. So how important do you think adaptability is where being ethical in our research and the work that we do is concerned?
Yeah. I have other slides. Can I share one? I think this is in here. I think I put this in here. Yeah. And so, you know, there's so much power in the stories, and I had a slide on breadth versus depth that I cut because I wanted you to see all of the incident types versus prioritizing, you know, a specific few. But this quote, which we mapped, this incident, which we mapped to community or public insights, is talking about the history of bad events that can result from biomedical engineering research or research more broadly. And the recognition is that as a field, we learn, right, from failure, kind of connecting to the prior quote. And it kind of connects with the conversation around trust, right, earlier. Like, what do we do when our systems fail or a society just doesn't trust our research enterprise? That's where I think the norms, the rules, right, become really important. Sometimes they're so intense, they're really cumbersome. But that's just that adaptability of our institutions. I don't know if I said this, but I share this in my class. While culture, if we want to use that word, shapes how people practice engineering, it's a circle, right? People shape culture, the norms, the rules, right? And so I think it's built into being ethical. I mentioned we did a study with folks in the health products industry. We also did a phenomenography there. It may be published soon in Science and Engineering Ethics. The most comprehensive way of experiencing ethics among these folks, we called stewarding culture, right? People recognizing that we need continuous improvement in this case, in our companies. I mean, I could keep going on about this, but like it comes back to then we have questions, right? This is the most comprehensive way. Do we really want students to get to the space where they're shaping culture? Like, why not? But some might disagree with that, right? Is that answer? I feel like I went in 5 directions. Thank you for the question.
I have a question. Sorry, I'm on this side.
Oh,
Hi.
there you go.
So as a student who has basically no experience within ethics research, but who took a mandatory class in like engineering ethics. I have a question of like when you take these experiences from faculty members and have it trickle down to students, so like budding young professionals, how do you, or like what is your opinion on that sort of cycle of culture shaping people and then people shaping the culture, when a lot of the times, from what I've noticed in my class and around my peers, these students who are involved in the conversations of ethics and engineering ethics are people who usually already have a very like vested interest in ethics, and the cycle of culture shaping students and students shaping the culture, it happens within that sort of closed sphere. So how do you recommend sort of opening that gate to students who may not care about ethics, may not know enough about ethics to get involved, and like how do you teach them and help them learn without sort of telling them how to think, and rather giving them the tools so they can think like about these topics themselves?
Yeah. Those are great questions, and I want the answer to those questions. And maybe some of us have some answers. It's hard. I don't know, I might ask the students who are passionate about ethics, what has inspired you? I don't want to necessarily put that back on the students, but we're developing this iron pin. Like, that's awesome. That's shaping culture. That's stewarding culture. What motivated that? Yeah. What motivated or inspired you to do this?
Thank you.
Uh-huh.
Oh, didn't think I'd be answering a question tonight. I think, and this is partially also a half question for you as well, because I'm still trying to figure it out. But I've always wanted to explore how to combat cynicism in students regarding ethics. I think as the world continues to look like it's crumbling around us, and this generation that's growing up right now, people can often fall into these pitfalls of like, well, I don't care anymore, why should I care about these things? And so building it into the culture of our school is one way to combat it, to normalize it. You can't force people to get involved, but if you make it something that's exciting and something that people want to get involved with, you can open doors for conversation to happen, not necessarily telling you, oh, you have to do X, Y, Z, this is how you do something, but just making it something that's more normal to talk about, makes it so that it's not as scary to approach.
Yeah, that's great. I tell my students ethics is fun, and I believe it. Sometimes it's sad, right? I teach an ethics class. It's an elective, right? So most of the students choose to be there. Often I hear these conversations around like, why would you have a course? Get it across the curriculum. There's all kinds of different stances. I think the more the better, right? The more touch points, the better. But that might not resolve this issue that some students just don't care. I think that's bigger than engineering. I think we got a lot of problems in my country right now, and I think cynicism isn't just engineers. I think it's pretty common among engineers. Engineers are very apolitical. I've heard folks talk about Aaron Sachs' work, right? They believe we're in a culture of meritocracy, myths, right? We might call these myths. So it's easy to be cynical, right? I don't know, I can speak for myself, like finding my community, finding awesome mentors, right? That's the critical incidence for me. No one asked that. I was reflecting on this. What has inspired me? I mean, I can show a picture, right? I've been working with Andrew for almost 15 years now, right? He's very passionate about ethics, right? And other people in our talk, we didn't talk about mentoring, but people get inspired, right, by their mentors to carry it forward. More of that, right? More of that in our institutions, our curriculum. There's not a right answer, right? It's a lot, right? A lot of different factors.
Fiona, did you have a question or? Oh, I thought you had. Thank you.
So I've been thinking about that response that you put up on the slide about the faculty member who was thinking about ethics in a new way because you'd asked the question.
Yeah.
And I was wondering if that is a thing that happens, that when people are given the space to think through what ethics actually means, they sort of take up that space, they fill that space in ways they might not, had you not asked the question. And so I was wondering if you think about your own research as one of those interventions.
I do, yeah. I think, I mean, for some folks, right, these stories are really powerful, and I felt guilty, right, sometimes having folks have to relive, and sometimes traumatic experiences in a second interview. But I think we know, like, having the space to think and reflect can also be therapeutic. And I think we see that with many folks, and that's not exactly your question. It's clarification on your own thoughts. Right, we experience maybe a lifetime of research and never pause think about the ethical touch points in that journey. And I think we saw many people maybe doing that for the first time. One of the quotes I love from the interviews is, I'm not going to get the quote right, but the idea is like, they don't think about ethics because if you talk about ethics, that means there's a problem, right? I'm from the perspective that everything we do is ethical, it's continuous, it's day to day, it's omnipresent. And that's maybe a different view than some people hold. Yeah.
Okay, well, I'm going to invite us all to have other kinds of conversations, but I did want to thank you for doing a whole number of things. Yeah. First of all, you turned sage on the stage to conversation and community, and I really appreciate that you can do that. I've known you to be a facilitator. And somebody asked a question, how do you get people to care? And I actually think we all care about things. I actually think if you listen to your heart, if you pause for a minute and don't try to be expedient, there's an impulse to care. And what you do, which is so ethical, you don't reject that impulse to care. And that is ethical. And so I appreciate you coming to Toronto. I appreciate all the conversations you've had with folks. I appreciate everybody here in the room who's participated in these conversations, whether thinking through them, whether talking to each other. There are a whole bunch of people on the programming team who made this happen. So thanks to all of you for being a community of people who care about ethics, who care about pausing and asking why, and not just how to, and not just how to faster. I think this is what ethics is all about. So thank you so much. There is a gift. I think there was like an umbrella, but he's had to use it already. So
I've already used an umbrella gift. So thank you, Julietta.
Here are the parts that are not as practical. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. So please join me.